Woo! It is cold here at the start of creation. Better get walking. Whew. Anyway, Genesis 1:2, the Hebrew there is V'ha'aretz hayita tohu vabohu v'choshek al panei tehom v'ruach Elohim mirachefet al panei hamayim. Let's walk through that. Welcome to verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1. I would like to start by saying a little bit more about my purpose here, our purpose here. I'm not trying to tear down any translation. I'm not trying to say your translation is no good, and I'm going to tell you what it really should be. Not going to give you the most scientific, linguistically accurate rendering possible of these verses. That's not the point of these little videos, of these word walks. The purpose here is to give you a sense of the Hebrew behind your translation and to hopefully pique your curiosity and, if nothing else, give you a little bit of a sense of, like I say, the Hebrew that's behind your translation. Hopefully get you interested, possibly give you some different ways to think about the text that you may have read many, many times. Give you a little bit of a different way of seeing things. So that's what we're here to do. So let's start with our first word. Our first word, v'ha'aretz. So v'ha'aretz, we've already gone over ha'aretz in the last video. You can check it out here if you'd like to go back and check that out. And so I won't go into detail on ha'aretz. Ha'aretz, this planet where we live, that's what we're talking about. And whereas in the last verse we had ve'et ha'aretz, specifically saying and the earth, now what we have is v'ha'aretz, not ve'et, but v'ha'aretz. So you could translate v again as and, but oftentimes it's really anything but and. Many, many, many things can be included under v. And the best translation in this case, and you'll see it in many of the well-done translations, is now. So that's what we're talking about. And what I'd like to say at this point, moving from verse 1 to verse 2, this is how I understand Scripture as a whole, broadly speaking. Scripture, I like to say, Scripture is a funnel. Okay? What do I mean by that? Well, just like a funnel is wide at the top and it narrows down, it gets everything down to a small point, so you can put a lot in the top, and then it gets less comes out at a time. It'll all eventually come out at the bottom, but it gets funneled, it gets narrowed down, and so you can focus on a little bit at a time at the end. And so that's what Scripture is doing. So in the very first verse, we have the most possible that you could talk about, everything. So you have the fewest words describing the broadest scope. Okay? You got a few words, and it's talking about everything. Then we come to the verse we're at now, verse 2, and we've narrowed the scope. So now at the end of Scripture, so I said in the beginning of the top of the funnel, the fewest words describe the greatest scope. Well, by the time we get towards the end of Scripture, we have the greatest number of words describing the narrowest scope. What do I mean? Well, as I said, verse 1 you have concerning just everything. Then you have however many verses where the focus comes down to the observable world and what you can see from here. And why that? Well, because Scripture is given to humans about human experience. A lot of things are addressed, but it's so that we can understand what it means to be here as one of God's people, creation of His, and it's from our experience. That's what the Bible is for. So then Scripture narrows down and focuses on just humanity. So we've got the planet and what you can see and experience from here. Then it narrows further and just focuses really on humanity, all humankind. Next, it narrows down to one people through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then it narrows further down to one lineage through David. Then it narrows finally down to just one descendant, one man, one person, the Son of Man, Son of God, our Messiah, Yeshua. So see what's happening in Scripture? You've got the first verse, it's everything. Then the planet, the solar system. Then you've got humans. Then you've got one people. And then one family and one person. That's what I mean when I say Scripture is a funnel. Okay? All right, so we just ended our last verse with, and the earth, ve'et ha'aretz. And so right here we have also, and the earth. Or is that what it says? So ve'et ha'aretz versus v'ha'aretz. Okay? So now, as I said, is the best option here, I think. Not only do I see a transition here in scope, so we're narrowing the funnel, but also I think the most appropriate option for the purpose of storytelling. And Scripture is a great story, well told. Yes, it's informative. Yes, it's what we need to know as far as God's concerned, what we need to know. But it's a story. It's told like a story. So importantly, now sets the scene. I don't really think that the now here means now a moment in cosmic time. I think it's rather now at this point in our story. I've told you this, now let's tell you this. That's the ha'aretz. And now the earth, this planet. Okay? Our next word, hayatah. Now, almost all English translations render this word was. I don't really think that's the best way to go. It can be was. It can mean was. It could be rendered was. But there's a little more going on here. There are a few, and one internet teacher in particular, that make a kind of a big deal about how hayatah doesn't mean was, and it can't mean was because what it really means is became or had become. And they like to really emphasize that because they have the teaching that something else came before and something happened to the earth, and so it had become in this state that we're going to describe next. Okay, it's a little much to emphasize that so much, but they're not wrong to point out that was is a little simple. Okay? I guess the idea they're trying to promote is that creation had been judged somehow and destroyed from an earlier state. And so now, where we pick up the story in the Genesis account, it had become this uninhabitable place. And so then they have room to talk about what came before. It's not necessary. The language, the words that we encounter here don't require that thinking, and they don't even really lend themselves all that well to that thinking. You'll see. Okay. In favor of the idea, not of a former time, but in favor of the idea that hayatah can mean had become or became, in favor of that idea is the fact that this verb more often than not expresses an action rather than a state of being. So was, that's a state of being, and became, that's more active. And usually the word in Scripture elsewhere has this sense of action, becoming, or something like that. However, no other Scriptures No other scriptures support the concept of a universal judgment on the world before the flood. You have to start with that idea and then try to wrap that in to this had become. Okay. Secondly, Exodus 20:11 teaches that the world and all that's in it were made in 6 days. Okay? It wasn't made at some other point, and now we've come to a pre-created world and we have this situation. So that's not right. Third, Genesis 1 gives the impression of describing one creation, not a recreation. So the whole story doesn't really work with the idea that we're coming up on something that's already been there for a while and these tragic things have happened. Okay. And really, Genesis 1:2 is best viewed as a description of the earth in the first stage of a process, not in the middle or the end stage of something that's long since gone on before. All right. We may be hair splitting a little bit on the was, since if we're talking about something that happened in the past, if it had become, then our perspective looking back on it, then it was. So you can still say was, even if it had become. I mean, so it's not like this impossible word. It's fine. Was is fine. Was is fine. But we heard in the last verse that haaretz had just been created. Okay, that's verse 1. Had been created then. Okay? And we're talking about the very next thing. Okay? The idea here is to be faithful to the active nature of this verb and fair to the story. Then we could say hayata means came into being. That makes more sense in the story, and it's fair to the use of the word elsewhere in Scripture. So God made the world. Now when the world came into being, whatever, okay? So it doesn't necessitate the idea that the earth's been around for a long time and you just didn't know that all this stuff had happened. No, it's not necessary. It's not even really in jives with the story very well. Okay? So moving on to our next word. Our next word, tohu. And we'll actually take 3 words, tohu vavohu. We're going to skip to our next word, vavohu, and we're going to look at these together. Bohu only occurs 3 times in Scripture, and always with tohu, so we'll look at these together. So, tohu vavohu. This is an expression. Tohu vavohu, it has a nice ring to it. And this expression, I think, is used because one of the reasons is because it has this sort of nice ring to it. Tohu by itself, this means unordered or unformed. Waste is another good way to render that. Waste, not like the trash, but if something's going to waste, it's usable, but nothing's happening there. You know, a wasteland. You know, a wasteland is a land that you could do something, but nothing's being done. Or this territory where nothing really can be done. There's some reason why nothing can be done there. Of course, in the case of creation, something can be done. God's going to do it. But as yet, it's waste. There's nothing being done with this unformed mass. So, formless, unformed, that's good. And many English translations do say formless. Perfectly fine. It does make sense. God made it, and it's just sitting there, not ready. And so now he's got to act. So our first description is a world with nothing but water. You say, but that makes no sense. A primordial planet would have no water at all. It would just be a giant lump of burning rock, molten lava. So there couldn't even be any water. So how does that make sense? Well, the Bible isn't a scientific paper. It describes the way things are in terms of human experience. Yes, if we claim the Bible is truth, I do, then it should be true, yes. But you want to treat the Bible fairly, as you would treat any other thing you read. on its own terms. The Bible doesn't pretend to be a scientific treatise on physics, okay? If someone comes in on a rainy day and says it's raining cats and dogs out there, you don't call them a big fat liar when you go to the window and you see that the yard is not full of dead pets. You understand there's a way of presenting information that's got more flavor to it, and that makes sense. So I like to say that the Bible is literal truth, poetically expressed. That's what we have here with the Bible. And one of the main characteristics of water is that it has no form of its own. It conforms to the shape of whatever's around it. So, unformed water. That's perfect. And looking at the whole thrust of the creation story, we're being told how Elohim takes this thing with no form and then forms it, giving it identifiable features: land, sea, mountains, valleys. But it starts with no form. That's key. And then once there is habitat in place, he endows it with, fills it with life, vegetation, animals, people. But it starts with no life. So that's important. Bohu means empty. Okay? But meaningful to our story is empty of what? And considering what's coming, the important lack is life. It's empty of life. So, tohu vabohu. In modern Hebrew, tohu vabohu, you know, if a mother comes into the kitchen and sees the kids have torn the whole place apart, they're dumping cereal on the floor, juice spilled everywhere, milk splattered on the wall, spaghetti thrown in the hair, cupboard doors all open, pots and pans being banged, she would say, in modern Hebrew, oh, everything's tohu vabohu. It's utter chaos. So some translations like this chaos, this idea of a wasteland of chaos, okay? But I think for us, the most important way to look at this in terms of the fairness to the story and to the words is formless and lifeless. Tohu vabohu, formless and lifeless. And it even gets that little bit of a rhythm. Tohu vabohu, formless and lifeless, okay? Moving on. Our next word, v'choshek. Now this word, thankfully, very straightforward, so we won't need to linger. Darkness. Choshek is darkness. I will say, I think it's important for the story to consider just what darkness is. Darkness isn't a quality of something. It's a lack of something. So our next word isn't telling us what's there. It's telling us what's missing, which is perfect since the next verse is going to address that very thing. So it's parallel to empty. It's a lack of light. Next, al. Another straightforward one. On or over. The Israeli airline, El Al, literally means to up, toward the above, or so figuratively, skywards. So El Al is skyward. Our next word is paneh. Paneh. This is your panav, your face. So paneh is a construction form of panav, face, your panav. Paneh, face of something. Okay, so paneh is our next word. It means the face. And could be surface. That also works. Then we come to tahom. Tahom, deep or depths. Many translations here say the deep, which is fine, the deep. Don't get hung up on the fact that we have no ha here, like ha tahom. And by the way, back in our other word, hayata, that ha is just part of the word. It's not the whatever. Hayata is part of the word. So, and here we aren't lacking ha. You can say the. In many languages, you can assume the. Not everywhere do you have to have a direct article. You can infer the in Hebrew and in other languages. For example, in Russian, if you want to say, I'm going to the store, you say, Я иду в магазин. Я иду в магазин. Well, there's no the. It's basically, I go store, or I go to store. You get the rest. I mean, people are smart enough to figure out where you're going, what you're, the store. Okay, I go store. That's fine. It's enough. And you can do that here too. In English, we miss it if we don't have it. So in an English translation, you want to put that there because it makes English more proper. But so don't worry about the. We can put that there. That's perfectly fine, just so that we're using proper English. So here with al panei tehom, we'll have over the face of the deep, or something like that, the surface of the depths. Now, some people like the idea of the fact that the Bible is not this thing that God wrote, but it's just one of yet another of many ancient writings, creation stories, and so they want to tie them together and look for things that are similar in other languages, other ancient cultures. Babylonian is a popular one because in the creation story there, the Enuma Elish, you have Marduk or Merodach, however you want to pronounce it, fighting Tiamat, and then vanquishing Tiamat, whose corpse is then used to form the world. And so because Tehom seems like it might be related somehow to Tiamat, then they say, some scholars want to say that Tiamat is Tehom. They're related, and so we just have another creation battle. But this linguistically has been shown to be false. It can't be connected. So if you've heard that, put that to the side. Here we have an original story told by God. In any case, it's an original story. It doesn't depend on anything else. Okay? The connection between Tehom and Tiamat is an outdated idea. It's no longer promoted by anyone familiar with these languages or the history or cultures. So it might be an internet phenomenon still, but it's not a real one, not in scholarship anymore. Tiamat is also part of a dualistic view of the heavens, where you've got powerful gods, a good one and a bad one, a perfectly good one and an evil one, and they're in constant battle, or there's been a battle. And nothing like that in the Bible. The Bible is not dualistic. All we have in Genesis is creation and its creator. Tehom is merely one feature of one small portion of a big universe, and the creator does with it whatever he wants. So Tehom is parallel to formless. So we had formless and lifeless. Now we have Tehom being parallel to formless. It's just deepness. You don't know what's down there. It's just deep, which can be terrifying. And what we have going on here is our first exposure to Hebrew poetry. Now, Hebrew poetry relies on stating the same thing twice, two different ways. So not just repeating it the same way, but saying the same thing two different ways for emphasis. And we find this a lot in Hebrew scriptures. And, the way it works is like in English, if you said, we had a meal, we ate lunch. Well, you've just said the same thing. Aha, well, get your story straight. Which is it? Did you have a meal or did you eat lunch? We had a meal. We ate lunch. Okay? That's how Hebrew poetry works. It's just to say, for emphasis, the same thing twice, saying it again the second way, a different way. And Yeshua uses this when he's telling the people in the marketplace, to what can I compare this evil generation? He says, you're like children in the marketplace that tell you, we played the flute for you, but you didn't dance. We sang a dirge for you, and you didn't mourn. In other words, it's not that they did two different things. It's that they did the same thing. No matter what they did, you responded wrong. We played happy music, but you weren't happy. We played sad music, but you weren't sad. That's the problem. No matter what their response is wrong. So Yeshua is saying about himself, here I am, no matter what I do, your response is wrong. That's what he's comparing them to. And so that's how Hebrew poetry works. So when it says tohu babohu, and then it says b'choshech al panei tahom, that's the same thing being said twice. Formless and lifeless, darkness on the deep. It's just two expressions of the same thing going on. It's like this hopeless condition. But then, and that's what's so great about telling a story like this. You've set it up, and now the next thing, which is Veruach. Okay, V, once again, this is and, or now, or something. Ruach. Ruach means breath. It can mean wind because of this movement of air. But the primary meaning is breath. For that reason, it's the word people use when they think of, or the word behind spirit. So ruach is spirit, but only because breath is inspired. You respire. So that's where spirit comes from, your spirit. It's the breath that's in you. That's the thing that makes you alive. So because for humans there is no life without breath, we have the idea of spirit, the thing that makes us alive. Later on, we'll see that Adam only comes alive when Elohim breathes into him. He inspires him, right? He gives him his spirit. The basic idea of ruach is air in motion. And once again, Elohim. Now, we've covered Elohim already, but I want to mention that some scholars want to translate this Ruach Elohim, which seems fairly straightforward, Spirit of God. They want to translate it as mighty wind. Why would they do that, taking God out of the picture? Well, last time we said that Elohim can, when it's used as a word, not a name, it can mean mighty ones. Because of this, it can mean great or mighty. Ruach can be translated wind, so they don't want to have Spirit of God. Some translators want to say, let's take God out of the picture and just, it's a mighty wind. You know, the primordial sea, this terrible chaos, this earth that's not ready yet, and a big wind, that just all seems natural, seems to work. Except in the language and in the story, it doesn't work. Okay? The biggest failure of this thinking is that in this chapter alone, in chapter 1 of Genesis alone, Elohim occurs 35 times. Okay? And in no other place could Elohim mean anything but the Creator. So it's really special pleading to say that, but in this one case, out of 35, this one, it's just a big wind. That is really special pleading. Elohim is Elohim. Everywhere in this chapter, it's stamped with him. And so that's what Elohim means. It's the person that we're talking about, the Creator, okay? Also, there's nothing in the text which requires this special exemption. Another case for ruach meaning wind is to keep Elohim, the Creator, in place, but say that's a wind from Elohim. Elohim sends a wind. The thinking here is that God also used a strong wind to part the Red Sea, exposing the dry land, and that seems to fit the creation story nicely. But this is also awkward since it's not the parting of water to bring forth the dry land, which is next in our story. It's the creation of light. So it's a little awkward. You really have to want it to mean that. It's not natural. So we'll stick with breath, and we'll stick with Elohim, the Creator, and you'll see what happens here in a minute. Our next word, mirachefet. We'll come back to this one. Our last three words are al, panei, and ha-mayim. Okay. We've already talked about al. We've already talked about panei. Ha-mayim is the, mayim, the waters. Waters, plural, okay? Like shamayim, but this is mayim. It's not heavens, it's water. So al panei ha-mayim. I wanted to cover these first since we've already handled them over the face of the waters. Okay? Tehom, the deep, should already mean water, okay? But here it's made explicit. So Tehom, it's the waters. So we have darkness and absence of light around the formless earth, but here comes Elohim to change all that. This is where it gets exciting. You know, I told you that we're going to get somewhere in the end, so this is it. Back to Mirachefet. Okay, whatever Mirachefet means, Ruach Elohim is doing it. Okay, now all the translations which render Ruach Elohim as Spirit of God also render Mirachefet as hovering, either hovering or moving. There's one fluttering, but you get the idea. It's hovering, moving around. Mirachefet, okay, the Spirit of God is like this, somewhere, pausing, hovering, brooding. Okay, now, there's another point against the rendering of mighty wind from before, since Mirachefet, which is what's happening, doesn't really fit with the wind blowing. Okay, it can't really mean that. It doesn't mean that. So, again, we're going with the breath of Elohim moving, but, and this is so cool, breath can move in two directions. So if you think of God breathing out, that's how we normally think of it. But when any of us breathe out, we must first breathe in. I love this, okay? For storytelling purposes, since the next thing coming in the next verse is God speaking, what could be more natural than for him to first take a breath? Okay, so how are we going to render this passage? Let's start from verse 1 and see what we've got so far. To begin with, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth came into being formless and lifeless, darkness and depth, while over the waters Elohim drew breath. See you next time.